I have a question. So being on the Bay of Fundy, how much were you affected by the tides when they were doing the shipbuilding?
Well, something very unique about the Bay of Fundy's vessels is that the vessels here were built with a very shallow keel. Basically, they were almost a flat keel, and that way they were able to sit on the ocean floor at low tide and not keel over. And the only difference it meant in their sailing was that they needed more ballast. But because all the ships built along the shore here were cargo ships, usually the cargo itself acted as ballast.
Okay. Any other questions about the museum and the area? Raise your virtual hand in Zoom.
Yeah, I don't really know how to work. I didn't follow the instructions. Oralee, I'm a McNutt from Truro.
Oh, lovely. Well,
yeah, and with connections in Five Islands and Great Village.
Yes.
We came by there in June of 2008. We were on our way from Fillmore's in Advocate Harbor, headed toward Nova Scotia. But my shipbuilding connections are in Yarmouth, where I'm great buddies with people like Eric Ruff and Peter Crow and Nadine Gates, all of whom you would know. And those museums down in that area are very dear to my heart. So it's very interesting to hear what the history was and how much you built since 2008, since we were there.
Yeah, we are, we're tenacious. We're a very tenacious group.
Well, what I remembered was that there was not very much land between the highway and the water, that it was narrow.
It is quite narrow. The building that we've built since 2008, the largest one, is the one that's shaped like a boat, is 25 feet wide and 62 feet long. It's actually built to replicate half of the length and half of the width of the last vessel built on the site. So it's in a sense a true half model.
Yeah.
Well, I really like the pictures of that building.
Thank you. It's a very attractive building, and its profile garners a lot of attention when people are going by. It's hard to ignore.
And I gather that's your archives and climate controlled and all those good things.
Yes, yes, that was one of the keys, because the original building, the one that's the Methodist church, was kept open on purpose, the walls inside, so that people could enjoy and experience the building of the building itself. So there's no insulation in that building, which is why I close in October. But the the archive room, the lower level of the new building, is completely insulated and has heat and humidity control specifically for our archives and storage.
Okay, so we have a couple other questions. So Ron, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Question. I just had a remark that I'm kind of amazed at the volume of shipbuilding that was going on in that area at that time. It's immense, really. Surprising to me.
Actually, on our shore between Parsboro and Apple River, the 62 kilometers, we have a log of knowing 700, and I think it's 23 tall ships that were built on that shore in 115 years. And that's not including the minesweepers or when they went into fishing boats. That's just sailing vessels.
Now, was that volume of manufacturing supported by timber grown in the local area, or was there some other reason why it was located there?
No, it was primarily the timber. As I mentioned, it started with because many of the people that were settling the area at that time were British loyalists who had been given land grants. And in England at the time, they had no building timbers left, and they weren't there. There were a lot of embargoes on them about going into the States or going into Europe. And so they tasked the loyalists to cut the timbers and build very rough-hewn ships and fill them with timber to send back to Britain. And and when they first started, they were taking the ships apart when they got to Britain as well, because they didn't need the ships, they just needed the wood. So they were using the whole thing, the ship and all the lumber that it could carry for building purposes. And there's a little thing in our museum that mentions that at first it was very derogatorily referred to as the ships built up some Nova Scotia creek. And eventually that actually became a note of pride to be the owner of a ship built up some Nova Scotia creek.
Thank you. That's quite interesting. So the disappearance of the industry, did it have to do with eventual change to steel construction of ships, or loss of timber, or what?
It wasn't the loss of timber, but it was the advent of the steamships and going into metal and fiberglass building. None of the shipyards in our area ever went into fiber or metal glass or fiberglass or metal. All the ships that were built on our shore were wooden right up until 1976 when the last ships were launched.
Do you have some kind of a registry of ships that are still extant that were built there?
As far as we know, there are a few of the fishing boats still in existence down in the Digby area and in Grand Manan in New Brunswick. As for the sailing ships, because they were working ships, they didn't actually have a very long lifespan. The typical lifespan of one of the sailing vessels from our area was only about 7 or 8 years.
Oh, that's interesting.
Okay, we have a couple of other people with questions. Can we move on? Patrick, go ahead, unmute yourself.
Hello, Oralee. Unfortunately, I missed half the talk because I was having lunch with an old friend. I'm talking from England. I was having lunch with an old friend up in north of London, and I've just got back on the train to catch the end of your talk. Fascinating little village or whatever you've got there. I like the lighthouse, which is very similar to the one at Minico. My name's O'Brien and you're O'Brien. We could be related distantly.
We could very well be.
So my question is, I love your tartan.
Thank you.
Is your shop online? Can I buy it online?
If you go onto our website, there is a shop on there, and you can just, it's kind of a half-ass shop, to be honest with you, just because I'm not that, I'm not that savvy. But certainly you can go onto our website and go into our shop and order a piece of tartan, and I'd be happy to send you.
Wonderful, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, then Rob Mazza has his hand up. Go ahead, unmute yourself.
Thanks, Brian. Oralee, as Diane mentioned, I'm connected with the Marine Museum of the Great Lakes at Kingston.
Yes.
And you've done a remarkable job in what you're doing in your museum. But just a couple of questions of museum orientation. What do you have a curator?
I am it. I am the I am the staff to speak of. I've been trained in archives and curatorial duties, but I also manage it. The only other staff we actually have are summer students who we hire on during usually July and August.
So you report to a board of directors, I presume?
Yes, I do. Yeah.
Okay. And how many visitors do you get each year?
Pre-COVID, we were seeing around 6,000, and our season runs from the 1st of May until the end of October.
Okay. And then for fundraising, you're looking at primarily donations and fundraising campaigns. Do you get grants from the province?
We belong to what's called the Community Museum Assistance Program of Nova Scotia. And it's kind of an evolving program at the moment. We're not sure what's happening to it. To date, we get approximately $7,000 a year from them. And as a museum person, I know that you would understand how far that goes. So primarily our funds are raised on site through admissions, the cafe and the gift shop, and through a lot of fundraising.
And what's your annual budget then?
Our annual budget is around 80,000.
8,000.
80.
Okay.
Yes.
That's
Yeah. We have actually 2019, our budget was $100,000. So.
Good. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay. Are there anybody, does anybody else want to ask a question? Please raise their virtual hand. If you otherwise, if nobody's raising their virtual hand, Maura, go ahead, unmute yourself.
You need to unmute yourself, Maura. Bottom left corner.
Okay,
There you are.
okay. I'm really used to this, but I have a question, Oralee, if you could,
Yes.
you help me out with some family history for my husband's family.
Yes.
And I wondered if you could just talk a little bit about those amazing books of genealogy that you have and the resource that you provide for unearthing family connections.
I'd love to. I have to give credit to Jack Wagstaff, who you may remember from my slideshow. Jack was the son of George Wagstaff that had the last shipyard and was actually raised in the shipyard. And his father was fortunate enough to realize that the age of shipbuilding on our shore was dying and sent him on to university to be a professor. Jack was my mentor for 7 or so years, and Jack actually started our genealogy files. He was very interested in his own family history and soon realized that if you had a connection on the shore, you were pretty much related to everybody on the shore at one point or another. So Jack started our genealogy collection, and I worked with him on it, and then eventually after his passing took it over. So he, a lot of the information he garnered was from talking to people, going through historical vital statistic records. We now have over 54,000 names on our genealogical files, dating back from the first Yorkshire residents that came, and the loyalists that came in. And we've been fortunate enough, we have a set of books called the Hatfield books. I believe there are 7 volumes of them. John Hatfield was actually the first granted landowner in our area. And so pretty much everybody on the shore at one point or another intercedes with the Hatfield. So that's why there's 7 volumes of these books, because the amount of work that has gone into them and the size of the volumes is incredible. And so I think those are the books that you're talking about, Maura.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're very fortunate to have those, and we do sell them. We have them done up, as I said, in 7 separate volumes. And we've had a lot of call for those because, as I said, pretty much everybody intersects with the Hatfields at some point or time. We also have quite a bit of genealogical information in our archives. I'm just trying offhand to think, but we must have about 20 different volumes of genealogical information from the different families. And I love genealogy. It's one of my passions, and I really enjoy digging into history and seeing if I can find things for people. I'm a helper. I like to help people. So if you have a maritime connection that you're stuck on and you want to find somebody who's willing to dig up something for you, let me know. I'm more than happy to do that. It really is a passion.
You were very helpful. I
Thank you
appreciate
so much.
Okay,
Oh, it was my pleasure. I do enjoy it.
George, go ahead, unmute yourself.
Well, that last exchange with so many Hatfields around, I guess there's no McCoys within the horizon. But
Our Hatfields fought the Kerrs.
Your one-way ships reminded me of, I mean, we in the interior of Canada, of course, had the rafts that were one way as far as Quebec, but I've recently had a tour of the River Lot in France, and before the locks were made it manageable by ships, they made ships in the upper regions of the river to take the farm produce down to the to the Garonne and on to Bordeaux. But the wood that the ships were made was as valuable as the cargo, and so they were roughly made and quickly dismantled because they couldn't take them back up the river.
Yes, we had some wonderful rafts made here as well. And actually, if I can share my screen for just a second again, if Graham would let me do that, I'll show you.
Yeah,
a
go
picture
ahead.
of
You
it.
should be able to do that.
Okay. This photo is of the Ellerton Raft, and it was actually built on our site in 1908. It was towed out into the Bay of Fundy, and then the story is that it was actually set adrift on the tides for New York, where another tugboat met it and pulled it in up to New York Harbor, and the timbers from that were used for the building of the wharves in New York, and some of them were actually taken to Boston and used in the what's now, I guess, Fenway.
Amazing. Thank you.
Okay. Jim, go ahead and ask your unmute and ask your question. Jim, you need to unmute.
Since you mentioned the Hatfields, I was wondering if Derek Hatfield was part of that family from there. Derek Hatfield, the round the world racer.
I'm not sure. The name doesn't ring a bell, but that doesn't mean he wasn't. I do know that when Jack was researching the history of the Hatfields, that he found that there were actually 4 distinct lines who had come into Nova Scotia from England, and he had traced back as far as he could, and he couldn't find where they intersected. So that's all I can really tell you is I know there were actually 4 distinct lines that did come into Nova Scotia from England, and as far as I know, he couldn't find a connection for them.
Okay, thank you for a marvelous talk, and thank you for the history, and thank you for the history of the one-way ships. That was
Thank you.
part of technology.
Well, thank you.
Okay. Next questioner is Julia, go ahead and unmute yourself.
I have two questions. First of all, let's see if I can remember them. What was the timber that was mainly cut down? What are the trees that you're using? Is it an oak or is it something else?
Actually, below the water line, they were using hardwoods, which were typically oak and maple. And then above water line, they were using the soft timbers. And because our ships were, as I had mentioned before, flat bottom, they only actually needed 8 feet of water to float them in, which is why they could build them up some Nova Scotia Creek. And that also meant that they didn't need as much hardwood for them as you would for a typical, ship with a 14-foot, 16-foot deep keel. So there were considerable amount of oak stands in the area, but they've all been depleted now, and mainly the wood that's left now is mostly softwood with a little bit of maple, but they used a lot of the maple and the oak for the keel sections, and then they were using spruce and tamarack and pine for the upper levels.
Were any of these ships used in war?
Actually, some of them were converted and used during World War I and World War II. There were also, as I said, they built the minesweepers in Port Grenville in 1942, and those were all wooden construction used by the British Admiralty in the coves around the UK. And there was a ship that was a ferry ship called the Kippawa that used to run the Bay of Fundy from Kingsport to Parsboro and Wolfville, and it was taken and used as a transport vehicle during World War II.
And are you thinking of putting your database of families, your family histories, up online at all?
I haven't to this point, simply because there's only so many hours in the day and I'm a one-woman show. But I do actually share information very readily with anybody who asks. And I do, when I get the chance, try to fill things in on my own family search site that I have with my connections, because of course I'm, like I said, connected to everybody on the shore.
Thank you very much. It was a wonderful discussion.
Thank you.
Any more questioners or comments before I turn it back over to Diane? Jim, go ahead. You'll need, yeah.
Back in the days before motors, how did they launch the ships? Was it just the tide, or how did they, when they built the ship, obviously on land, how did they get it into the water?
Most of the ships they did build on a small slipway. The slipway would be built just above tide line, with the slip itself going down into the water at high tide. And we used to have a gentleman that came around and sold meat out of his truck, and he was telling me once that as a child, his father would come down the shore in his horse and buggy, and he would come with them, and they would bring all the fat renderings from the plant, the meat renderings, and every dog in the village would follow the truck, but they would take the renderings to the shipyards, and that would be what they would use to grease the slipways. So they would unblock the ship as it was finally ready to go, and push it by hand down the slipway and into the water.
Oh, how interesting. I recall that the expression "good deal" came from a ship full of the wood that could be reused, and that was the origin of the expression "a good deal."
That's right. Yes, there's so many interesting words and phrases that have come from ships and shipbuilding. being having a bit of a sense of humor, my favorite is always freeze the balls off a brass monkey. Because the brass monkey was the triangle that held all the cannonballs.
Yes.
And when they got cold, they would freeze and the balls would fall out of the brass monkey. And I've always enjoyed that phrase for some reason.
Okay.
Thank you.
An innuendo, that's why.
One last question before turning it back to Diane. Go ahead, Ron.
Yeah, just an observation that launching the boats on skids covered with fat renderings was exactly the same technique used at the National Yacht Club here in Toronto until we moved to a new location. I think that is done in some of the other clubs too, perhaps, but the boats were on, you know, wooden skids, and they were pushed over on with tallow painted on these beams until they got to the Marine Railway, and then they were strapped onto a rail car and rolled down into the water.
Okay.
Still use the Queen City Yacht Club.
Yeah, Queen City still does that, and we still buy food grade lard because it doesn't smell, because we bought pork lard one time and that was a bad thing. So I'll turn it back over to Diane.
Thank you, Graham, and thank you, Oralee. That was absolutely fascinating. I do have a couple of questions. I wanted to know how many volunteers you have. I know you have students in the summer, but you've done a lot of work over the years, and you have a place that I'm sure invites people in all the time now. So many different things to see. And do you do school groups?
We do school groups. Of course, the last 2 years have been a little different. I really enjoy doing the school groups because we do, our museum is very much a hands-on museum. So when we have school groups, we actually take them out and teach them how to use a two-man crosscut saw and the hand planes and things like that. So we do a few school groups. Unfortunately, like I think most areas now, funding is very, very hard to find for school groups. And because of our remote location, we don't get as many as we like. For volunteers, we have a very active senior community. We don't get a lot of on-site volunteers, unfortunately, simply because most of our community is over 70, and they don't like to commit to time frames. My husband does a lot of volunteering. He calls himself my voluntold. And he actually looks after he's a modeler, so he looks after all our models and helps me out. It's it can be very interesting on the what we call the shoulder season, May until June, before I get my students in, because as I said, I'm a one-woman show. So I cook, I clean, I do tours, I do archives, I do genealogy, I change light bulbs, and I mow the grass. So, but I mean, when it started, which was 25 years ago, of course, our volunteers were my age, and they were very active in that time frame. The first 10 years. They were still very active, and it was run primarily by volunteers. Very seldom did they have even a summer student. But as the years have increased, it's gotten harder to get the on-site volunteers simply because of the age. But if anybody wants to come to Nova Scotia for a summer and spend it volunteering at the museum, I'd be thrilled to have you.
That's a thought. That's a big thought.
I can probably even arrange room and board.
Well, Rob Mazza, you've got a good role model there ahead of you. I mean, you guys have done so much work, and I congratulate you. I particularly loved your replica ship upside down, that building that you built, the what did you call it? The wave and
Wind and wave.
Wind and wave. absolutely beautiful. Absolute. And I look forward to being there one day to see it.
Thank
I'm-
you.
I'm so glad that Maura told me about you and that you were able to come and speak to us today. So let's
Well, it's
give
been,
Oralee just a nice little round of Shellback. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
thank you.
It was
It's been my
wonderful.
absolute pleasure. You guys are great. And I really enjoyed meeting Maura and helping her out with her genealogy. And I'm glad she connected me to you guys. It's been
Yeah.
a lot of fun and I really appreciate it.
Well, you know, we know a lot about things that are going on around Toronto. It's really nice to hear a little bit about other parts of the country. So again, thank you.